At Radio Pictures, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers made 9 films over 6 wonderful years. That's only 1 year less than the Beatles lasted. They wanted to go out with a bang, so their final film together was a very different animal, the story of Vernon and Irene Castle. How different? Well, it's not a rom-com. It's a period piece. There's very little singing. It's a tragedy. Fred dies at the end. Spoilers. The choreography is technical rather than character-driven. And probably the most remarkable, it was a remake and a true story. So first, a little bit of background that the audiences in 1939 would have known going into this movie. The real Vernon and Irene Castle were celebrities who rose to fame by spreading dance crazes across Europe and America. They wrote a hit book on ballroom dancing. They starred together in Irving Berlin's first Broadway show. They filmed their own 50-minute autobiography called The Whirl of Life, which you can see on YouTube. Whirl of Life breezily blurred the lines between autobiography and outright fiction. In their meet cute, Vernon saved Irene from drowning with his Apollo-like form. They discovered a mutual love of dance, but her parents don't like Vernon, so they elope to Paris, taking along with them her trusty valet, Walter. In Paris, they struggle, but eventually land a gig at the Café de Paris, demonstrating new dance crazes. They return to the US, rich and famous, so Irene's ex-boyfriend hires some cartoonish thugs to kidnap her. Vernon switches into action hero mode, and he beats the tar out of them. This last section, as far as I can tell, is 100% fictional, and was wisely dumped in the Fred and Ginger remake. 3 years after making The Whirl of Life, Vernon Castle died in an airplane tragedy. Irene, however, didn't slow down. 1 year after Vernon's death, she remarried, and then she remarried well and often. She continued acting on stage and in films, and allegedly she designed the jerseys for the Chicago Blackhawks for one of her husbands, the hockey team's founding owner. She also found a role in 1939 as a consultant on Radio Pictures' The Story of Vernon and Irene Castle, starring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. We'll get to how well that went down in a moment. Like Whirl of Life, the Astaire-Rogers movie shifts in tone radically from Act 1, goofy romance, to Act 2, career melodrama, to Act 3, gangsters in the original and war movie in the remake. In some ways, the musical version closely follows the silent film. Both start with a potential drowning. A cute dog scene brings the couple together, their Paris apartments are almost identical, and they have very similar dance montages in Act 2. And both include the loyal servant, Walter. Which brings us to the first of Irene Castle's many objections against this film. As you may have noticed, Walter Brennan is not a black man, and he's portrayed as much more of a wimp than Walter was in Whirl of Life. As odious as the studio-mandated whitewashing of Walter is, Walter Brennan still brings a warm spark of humanity to this film. He's a great actor. Those 3 Oscars he's carrying aren't for nothing. Irene had other objections, though. The castle's manager was a well-known lesbian, and though played with bombastic warmth and subtlety by Edna May Oliver, Irene felt it just wasn't enough. It was a little too papered over. And as for the fashions, Ginger refused to actually chop her hair into the signature castle bob, and the women in the 1939 film all wore bras, which Irene declared was absolutely anachronistic. I actually don't disagree with Irene Castle on any of these complaints, but they're ironic when you consider how prominently the earlier Astaire-Rogers films featured both male homosexuality, yeah I know, not the same thing, and braless women. This is by far the most conservative movie they ever made together. I find the first section of Vernon and Irene Castle pretty dull. The old-timey shtick is laid on thick. Ooh, stripy suits, ukuleles. Ginger Rogers was never really meant to play a virginal ingenue. She's much better as a saucy wit as she is in the other films. And the comedy, it sucks. Exceptions. Lou Fields shines playing himself as Vernon's kindly manager, and Irene's family are pretty cute in their blunt attempts to see the couple get together. So they get married and they head to Paris, and the movie shifts into more comfortable Fred and Ginger territory. Lots of dancing. It's a standard showbiz plot, and of course they triumph, but along the way there is some deft footwork. Then World War I breaks out, and the movie finds its footing. It becomes a melodrama with this deep sense of doom. Despite Irene's fears, Vernon joins the Royal Canadian Air Force, because the United States had not yet entered the war to end all wars. And you know what's coming. As the war ends, Vernon bravely flies one last unrequired mission to take photos of the enemy lines. But they yank the rug out. Vernon actually survives, and he shows up unexpectedly in Paris to dance with Irene one last time. It is a great scene. But no, he dies soon after. He sacrifices himself to avoid hurting 2 other flyers in a training session. Irene, who's in Paris for a romantic getaway with Vernon, ends up dancing with Vernon's ghost instead. It's really sad. Perhaps to conserve the serious tone, the director left out one real-life detail. Just like Fred in Fall of the Fleet, the real Vernon Castle had a pet monkey, and the monkey was with him up until the end. I mean, the very end. It was in the fatal plane crash, and the monkey somehow survived. The subtext of this film is not buried too deep, especially if you're a 1939 audience on the brink of joining World War II. Vernon's frustration at not joining the fight,
Fine bunch of men.
the sinister map of Germany. I mean, they may have laughed their way through the Depression, but Fred and Ginger were not laughing their way through the war. It all adds up to some very well-executed propaganda.
The Americans have come into the war!
And a very, very effective tearjerker. It's not Casablanca, but could Humphrey Bogart do this?